I've got the real honor of introducing somebody that's known through these parts as Mr. Santa Clarita Valley. He's a national award-winning satirist with the local Signal newspaper. Here he is, Mr. Santa Clarita Valley, Mr. John Boston.
Howdy, everyone. The Santa Clarita Valley is not so much rich in history. We are filthy wealthy in history. The old Tataviam Indians had a saying called Hami Kwa Umi, and it means, where are you going? And it means not just, are you going from point A to the rock over there? It's more of a question of, where are you going in your life? Now, I haven't always been a historian. When I was a young man in my 20s, when the Signal newspaper was across the street in these little redwood bungalows, I had the privilege, which I didn't know at the time, of sharing an office with a fellow by the name of A.B. Perkins. Now, A.B. Perkins has been here since the days when dirt was fresh. And he was the town historian, and he knew everything there was to know about the history of the Santa Clarita Valley. I shared an office with this man for over a year. Didn't ask him one single question about the history of the Santa Clarita Valley. I could just kick myself. But I was a young man, and I looked upon A.B. Perkins, whose photograph, or rather whose painting is behind us here, and I looked upon A.B. Perkins as just kind of a grumpy old man with whom I had nothing in common. And now I'm starting to kind of be a grumpy old man myself, and I really regret not asking him any questions. We're here in the Saugus train depot today, and it has a very rich history. I'll try to tell you a little bit of the gee whiz aspects of a lot of things probably some of you already know. This whole train depot was moved lock, stock, and barrel about 2 miles down the road, and they had to do it in the middle of the night. And about 2 in the morning, this gigantic behemoth of a building is going down San Fernando Road, and it was right around the time the bars were closing, and there was this fellow who had come out. He was rather drunk, and he just was enraptured about looking at this train depot going down San Fernando Road, wasn't watching where he was going, and he hit a guy on a motorcycle, just knocked him like 3 blocks. Fortunately, the guy wasn't hurt too seriously. You'll notice when you go outside, the Saugus train depot is a 2-story affair, and back when it was down the road, the station manager used to live upstairs. And during the 1950s, there was a gal by the name of Leah Rosenfeld who was the station manager. She had 13 children, okay, ages 2 to 23. Her husband was the train manager of the San Joaquin depot. And frequently, almost every day, they were constantly putting children, you know, like a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 11-year-old from Saugus to San Joaquin. And then, you know, her husband would send, you know, the children, 4 children back. And they were constantly communicating, okay, who has whom, you know, I've got 8 kids, how many do you have? Okay, I guess they all arrived safely. And I guess also with 13 kids, boy, her husband must have really, really liked her. During the Depression, actually a little bit before the Depression, it was during Prohibition, it's actually during the Depression, but you couldn't drink alcohol, of course, you couldn't buy it or sell it. A train came through here in the very early 1930s, and it stopped at this station, and it was carrying boxcars loads of these big, huge 50-gallon wooden casks of wine for the Catholic Archdiocese. And some thirsty thieves got wind of all this sacramental wine, you know, being stored here at the station temporarily, and they snuck under the train, and with a giant auger, they were like boring underneath the boxcar into the wooden barrels, and then siphoning off all this sacramental wine. Besides being wealthy in history, we're also rather controversial in history. We have Clarita Canyon a couple of miles down the road. Now, for a lot of you historians out there, I'm sure you realize that, you know, we are given the credit of having the first major gold strike in California 7 years before the American River up north. Gold was discovered here in 1842. But there's a debate. Was it discovered in Clarita Canyon, or was it discovered somewhere in Castaic, or was it discovered somewhere in San Francisco Canyon? There are records of major gold finds in San Francisco Canyon as early as the 1820s. There is a great story about a location called the Los Padre Mine. And it's in the hills somewhere north of Castaic. The history class that I teach, I always give extra credit. If any of my students will find this Los Padre mine and bring in the untold millions in gold, you get extra credit. Okay. So that mine was the records of that being discovered in the 1790s. So, you know, this even predates the 1842 gold discovery. Pre-World War II, when the St. Francis Dam, after the St. Francis Dam burst, there was a rejuvenation in gold mining here in Placerita, Bouquet, and especially the San Francisco Canyon area. When this great St. Francis Dam burst and sent this 200-foot wall of water cascading down San Francisco Canyon, the place was just immediately filled with gold prospectors, and it helped the local economy because professional and amateur people would come up here to spend a weekend panning for gold, figuring that this big, you know, disaster had like uncovered untold wealth in gold and such. One little tidbit about Placerita Canyon that few people realize, that it was almost made a national park. Prior to World War II, Newhall Land and Farming, the big Uber developer that once owned, you know, most of the Santa Clarita Valley, still does, they were a little bit in arrears in their tax payments, and they worked out a deal with the federal government and the County Board of Supervisors to siphon off some water from some neighboring projects and create this huge national park called either Placerita National Park or Santa Clara National Park. World War II came along, and kind of that got lost in the shuffle. Now, it was made a state park, Placerita Canyon, and it is famous today for the oak of the Golden Dream, okay? Now, this is supposedly the one giant big oak tree where the first major gold discovery was found in Southern California in 1842 by Francisco Lopez. The thing is, a lot of Forest Service historians and other local historians kind of are debating whether or not even Placerita Canyon was the site of this discovery, and certainly was it this particular tree. Now, few people realize that in 1960, we had a huge fire that came through Placerita Canyon, burned down a lot of trees and stuff, including, supposedly a story I heard, the original oak of the Golden Dream. And some road department crews from county and state were cleaning up there, and they had all these brand new signs, and the old oak of the Golden Dream apparently had burned down. And they have a new sign that says Oak of the Golden Dream, and they're going, well, where do we put this? And they're kind of, well, there's a good looking oak tree. Boom, you know, put the sign in front. I mentioned Newhall. The town of Newhall was founded in 1876, and it was named after the financial magnate Henry Mayo Newhall, wonderfully energetic fellow who had his fingers in just everything. Kind of a gee whiz anecdote, Henry Mayo Newhall left the East Coast as a young man to make his fortune as a prospector out here in California. And he didn't do well, but he made a fortune, you know, as an auctioneer and businessman. And he left his wife like almost the day after they got married. She was a teenage bride, and he went out here to make his fortune. And he was gone a couple of years, and he, of course, would write to his wife and such, and you know how much he missed her. And finally, one day, after he had made a fortune in a relatively small amount of time, Henry Mayo Newhall sends a letter to his wife back east and says, honey, I miss you to pieces. I'm paraphrasing. Honey, I miss you to pieces. I want you to come. Actually, I'm coming out to the East Coast to pick you up so that we can come back out and begin our life again out in San Francisco. Puts a stamp on the envelope, mails it, gets on a boat from San Francisco, goes down the western coast all the way to Panama so he can pick up across Panama, go up the coast to Boston and meet his wife. Unbeknownst to Henry Mayo Newhall, his wife has written him a letter. Honey, I miss you to pieces. I'm going to come out and visit you in San Francisco, and I'll be seeing you in a few weeks. Puts a stamp on the letter, mails it, you know, and she heads down the East Coast. Now, the two of them don't know that the other one of them has like left, and they are both going down their respective coasts together. They get to Panama, which is pre-canal days. They cross Panama. They meet on the sidewalks of Panama City, just bumped into one another. Now, anywho. Newhall Land and Farming, which is now one of the most, accurately run companies on the planet, way back when used to have like a really primitive system of bookkeeping where they had one ledger and two pens. Red ink for whenever they spent anything, and black ink for whenever they got any money. And they would never register in the book what the red ink meant or what the black ink meant. It's like if they bought 1,000 miles of irrigation pipe, they would put down $500 in red with no notation. And if they sold some land and got $10,000, they would just write $10,000 in black, and no one knew where the money went or what it was for. The entire Santa Clarita Valley was up for sale by Newhall Land and Farming, their portion of it, in the 1930s. Asking price, $750,000. That would get you like one upscale house here in the Santa Clarita Valley today. Another reason why we are so rich historically here, of course, we are the navel of the universe as far as transportation. In 1876, Northern and Southern California were linked by the railroad, which comes right through the old Newhall Tunnel, one of the longest in the world. That was built primarily by Chinese workers, and after the railroad was completed, well, the workers were laid off immediately. A lot of them didn't have any place to go, and several of them just took jobs wherever they could around the Santa Clarita Valley, specifically at one huge meat packing place in the 1880s. And about every 2 or 3 months, the entire workforce to this meat packing company would quit. And it turns out that the guy who was the manager of the Chinese labor force was a Tong. That was like sort of the Chinese mafia. And he got a bonus every time he hired someone. And he got $1 per person for everybody he hired. So every 2 or 3 months, he fired everyone in the meatpacking plant and then hired them back the next day. We were a Wild West town here, even up until the 1970s. There were more saloons than churches here at the turn of the century, and oddly enough, a group of prohibitionists from Kansas decided to buy up a big chunk of property here in Newhall and start a prohibitionist community. And there was a young fellow by the name of Henry Clay Needham, a hard-luck fellow who ran for the president 3 or 4 times in his career. Once couldn't accept the nomination because he got food poisoning, and they had to nominate someone else that year. He was kind of hard luck because when he even ran for president here in the Santa Clarita Valley, he never got enough votes. He didn't even win the Santa Clarita Valley. But he tried to create this prohibitionist community, where all the prohibitionists from America would join here, and you could like enjoy the sunshine but no alcohol. But the thing was, they had a clause in their real estate agreements that if you bought property from the John St. John prohibitionist people, you had to sign a waiver that said if anyone was ever caught on your property drinking alcohol, your land and home was forfeiture to the seller. So it's like if your drunk cousin happens to stumble over and just be on the corner lot, portion of your lot, you could lose your house. And not even the dumbest, or prohibitionists wanted to sign a contract like that. Another famous thing we have here is Beale's Cut. That 90-foot chasm in the up there by Sierra Highway. The first car to come through there was, I believe, a 1902 auto car. And it had the primitive gravity-fed carburetor, which meant that it tried to go up the incline of Beale's Cut and couldn't make it because it kept stalling. It slid back down. They eventually got it through by driving it backwards up Beale's Cut. We are also famous for Mentryville, the oil village. In 1893, there's a huge earthquake here, okay? The few residents here in the Santa Clarita Valley got really mad at the people in Mentryville. They thought that all the drilling in the ground for the oil caused this huge earthquake, and this big posse of people went up there to say, hey, quit all this drilling, you're causing earthquakes. Mentryville was the first community in California to be lit by natural gas, and kind of in the gee whiz mode. There were Bigfoot sightings in Mentryville in the 1940s. We have the historic Ridge Route here in the Santa Clarita Valley. When it was first built, a very treacherous, narrow, windy road. And if you're going up the Grapevine today, you don't want to get behind a truck. Well, it was 20 times worse back at the turn of the century. Trucks going up the Grapevine could only make it at a rate of about 2 miles an hour. You can walk faster than that to pass them. Now, I mentioned what a curvy road this historic ridge route was. In the news of late, we get stories every once in a while about carjackings. Well, this is nothing new. These little bands of outlaws and singular road agents would hide out in these little 2-mile-an-hour curves and stuff. And when someone would go by to slow down, like, to 1 or 2 or 3 miles an hour to make some of these hairpin curves, these bandits would come running out from behind a boulder or a tree, just literally running next to the car, with a gun, and they jump on the old running boards, and pull the people over and steal their cars and rob them. And this worked most of the time, except for twice. In 2 separate instances, some bad guys jumped on the running board, stuck a gun inside the car, and the driver grabbed the guy's wrist and then just started accelerating. And in one case, ran a bandit into a tree, and in another case, ran another bandit into a boulder. Our city seal, it has the oak tree on it, and but prior to, oh my goodness, around 1910, 1905 in there, the valley was littered with oak trees. And a newly formed automobile club used to write about how wonderful it was to come up to the Santa Clarita Valley, for a weekend picnic with all the tens of thousands of oak trees and such. Well, over the years, farmers cut down most of the trees, and Newhall Land and Farming, bless their hearts, okay, they cut down thousands of trees for making charcoal for the bakeries of Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley. We are also famous for the third worst man-made disaster in American history. That was the breaking of the St. Francis Dam in 1928, when about 500 people lost their lives when the dam burst. There was an old-timer who was around. He was a young man. He was like 13 or 14 or 15 when the dam broke, and he was helping out the rescuers the next morning, looking for survivors and such. And he found a neighbor girl who was just beginning, how should I say this, the flower of her womanhood. She was about 12, 13 years old, and she had been swept away by the floodwaters. All her clothes had been ripped off, and she was way up in a big oak tree, okay, stark raving naked. And this young man at the time, goes to rescue her, and he puts a ladder against the tree, and he climbs up, and he has a blanket, and he throws this naked young girl over his shoulder and tries to cover up as best as he can, and he carries her down. And he was telling me at lunch about 15 years ago, he said, I see that woman every day of my life in the streets of Newhall for 50 some odd years, and she's never said one word to me. She's still embarrassed about me carrying her buck naked down that ladder out of that tree. One of the huge things we're famous for in the Santa Clarita Valley is movies. To my knowledge, the first film ever shot here in the valley was a silent movie called Bronco Billy's Christmas Dinner. And Bronco Billy was a local boy, and he was like the first of many local cowboy stars to star in the silver screen. There was a guy by the name of Red Lemieux, who was a child actor in the silent movies, went to Newhall Elementary. There's Tom Mix, who had his little studio out here. Neat little story about Tom Mix. He did a Western once where he is being chased by bad guys over by Beale's Cut, okay? And there's this posse of like 20 some odd guys, and Tom Mix is on his Wonder Horse Tony, which was bought over there in Placerita Canyon. And he and Tony come to the edge of Beale's Cut and just hit the brakes, and they look over at that 90-foot precipice, and and then they look at the posse behind, and then he like wheels his horse around. He goes back about 50 yards, and Tom Mix and Tony just like, and they whips Tony, and he jumps. He and Tony jump Beale's Cut. Boom. Now, in that time frame of the 20s, everyone is still kind of close to the earth, and everyone knows about horses and jumping and stuff. And the audiences were just aghast, at seeing Tom and this horse go over Beale's Cut. And Tom Mix is like sticking his chest out. Yeah, it was a very dangerous, death-defying stunt, but I did it, And then a couple stuntmen said, no, it wasn't Tom Mix, it was we jumped over Beale's Cut. And the truth be known, it was actually just special effects. Tom and Tony just rode, across this wooden ramp, and they just did a special effects blend together. But Tom Mix had a really good friend by the name of Will Rogers. Will Rogers, about a year later, makes a Western in which he duplicates Tom Mix's famous jump. Will Rogers is being chased by bad guys, and he and his horse come to the edge of Beale's Cut, and he looks over, and then he wheels back and goes back about 50 yards, and he whips his horse, and Will Rogers and his horse jump over Beale's Cut. But Will Rogers does Tom Mix one better. While he's right in the middle of the air of Beale's Cut, Will and his horse do a triple somersault, then land on the other side. We had Ben Johnson, the Academy Award-winning cowboy actor, live out here for a while. Slim Pickens used to ride in the rodeos. We had world-famous rodeos out here. Hoot Gibson owned the Saugus Speedway for many years. Harry Carey, one of the few stars to make it successfully from the silent movies to the talkie movies, made 300 pictures and had his famous ranch out in San Francisco Canyon. Gene Autry had the Melody Ranch. He was actually going to make his Gene Autry Western Heritage Museum out here in Placerita Canyon, but his wife kind of thought, well, it's like too far out here amongst the horny toads and sagebrush and stuff. I'd rather have out in Glendale where my debutante friends can enjoy it. And of course we have Bill Hart, William S. Hart, the original cookie cutter mold of the famous cowboy movie star. Hart had a Shakespearean background, and he brought the characters of Hamlet, Macbeth, and all these tortured great souls of literature to the prototype of the Western star. And I've heard interviews with lots of people from Clint Eastwood to John Wayne crediting William S. Hart for creating this very deep introspective Western character. When he passed away, he deeded all his land and property, or most of it, to the Los Angeles County. His son, Bill Hart Jr., didn't particularly like that and wanted to contest that. He shows up at his father's cremation ceremony with a court order demanding his father's brain. We were, for a while, called the Little Santa Clara River Valley, or the Little Santa Clara Village. And a few thousand people out here. And in history, I think there was like one line of demarcation, one benchmark where you could say this is where we change from like a quiet rural western area to our current beginnings of a yuppie concentration camp with all the townhouses and condos. And that is with, when we turned in 1960, we were the first rural community in California to go from operator-directed dialing to direct dialing. Now before, you'd have a business like Newhall Lumber, had the easiest telephone number in the world to memorize, 1. Okay, our newspaper's telephone number was 8. I remember you could call, and if I wanted to call someone across town, I had to talk to an operator first, and then sometimes the operator would say, it's kind of late. Isn't it a little late for you to be calling your friend? I get that. But with a flick of the switch in 1960, we went from going through an operator to direct dialing, and we went from little tiny 1 and 2 and 3-digit phone numbers to telephone numbers with digits, 259 and 252. And from that point on, I think that began this rapid acceleration of growth from a rural farming, ranching community to a suburban, community which we are today. I mentioned, how not rich but wealthy we are in history. We are the home of Tiburcio Vázquez, the famous womanizing bandito who terrorized California for several years. Vázquez Rocks, named after his hiding place. We had the last major range war in American history, the Castaic Range War, that lasted for 20, 30, 40 years, and depending whose numbers you count, anywhere from 27 to 40 people killed over this range war. We had the Crown Valley feud, again up there in the Acton Agua Dulce area at the turn of the century. Very rarely did you ever have one-on-one gunfights in the streets, but this Crown Valley feud ended with the 2 leading citizens of Acton. It's almost like the mayor and your congressman, bumping into one another as kids and stuff, like bumping shoulders, and it finally ended up in a gunfight. Where this one fellow, Rosie Melrose, shot the mayor of Acton. And the mayor of Acton was this very serious German fellow who had no sense of humor, and Billy Melrose was this American guy who was always pulling practical jokes. The mayor's dog one day attacked Billy Melrose's dog. He had this little white fluffy, lap dog, and Billy stepped in to save his dog. The mayor's dog bit him. He shot the mayor's dog, and from there they got in this shouting match. And several years later, the mayor went after Billy Melrose with a shotgun, and Billy Melrose was not a guy you would mess with. Besides being a laughable guy, he shot the mayor, I think it was 3 times in the heart, and on the coroner's report, the coroner wrote, "Good grouping for the bullets." Rosie Melrose would end up being a delegate for Teddy Roosevelt at his convention. We were almost the site of Newhall, of Los Angeles International Airport. In the 50s, they were going to build a 26-mile-long tunnel from Castaic to the San Joaquin Valley. Never made it. Gerald Ford was supposed to speak one day at Cal Arts, and he had to cancel at the last minute. Bleachers for about 2,000 people ready. Gerald couldn't make it. It seems like he had to take the oath of office because that day before, Richard Nixon resigned. I leave you with this. Back in the 1700s, when the Tataviams lived here, their main village was a place called Chaguillabit. And when the Spanish explorers first came there that first day, there was a big maypole in the center, there was a marriage party going on, and there were these Native Americans dancing stark raving naked there, okay? The Padres soon, got rid of that, pastime. They thought that was very vulgar, and you shouldn't be dancing around, any sort of pole like that, especially with no clothes on. History is circular. History repeats itself. About 10 years ago, there was a place called the Blue Moon Restaurant, which is smack dab where the Chaguillabit, main central village was. And after the Blue Moon folded, Newhall Land and Farming leased out this building to some San Fernando Valley businessmen. And unbeknownst to Newhall Land, the guys who were running this place were secretly building a live nude dance bar, okay, in the middle of very staid Santa Clarita Valley. And Newhall Land and Farming, when they heard about this, no nude dancing in the Santa Clarita Valley, especially around a brass pole, and they came in, threw the rascals out, and bulldozed the restaurant. So anyway, history repeats. Hami kwa umi, where are you going? Thank you.